Congratulations on this exhibition. It looks fantastic, and I know how much work you put into it. I also want to thank all of you for being here. A typical Saturday in September in Houston means you have 12,000 options for art events. So we're really glad that you're here with us for this one because I love talking to Ruhee, and hopefully you'll participate with your questions. We won't save the questions till the end. If you have a question that you feel like is germane to what we're talking about, just pipe up, raise your hand. We'll probably talk for a little bit over 30 minutes. And then, of course, she'll be here afterwards if you have a question that follows up. In addition to anybody who's tuning in via Instagram, we're going to monitor that so that if you have questions, they'll roll into this in-person space and Ruhee can answer them for you. And again, just thank you all so much for being here. So, first question maybe is, can we talk a little bit about how you and I know each other?
Yes. So in many ways, Bridget was the one who found me through Asia Society Texas Center. And I guess before we go too far into it, I do want to thank everyone for being here as well. It's so exciting to see so many familiar faces and as well as new faces too. But yeah, like we met at Asia Society Texas Center in Houston, and I was part of the Artists in Residence or Artists on Site program in, I believe, summer of 2022. Even though it was just a year ago, it almost feels like a lifetime ago. There's so many things that have happened since then. But Bridget reached out to me and she asked to do a visit. And Bridget was also the former curator there. So that's how we got connected.
Yeah. So a backstory to that is, if we haven't yet met, I was at Asia Society from 2014 to 2022, and part of our response to COVID in 2020 was the creation of this project called Artists on Site, which was a way to platform and support Houston-based BIPOC artists. So I took care of that project in 2020 and 2021, and I give all credit to Caitlin Ellison and the rest of the team that helped during the transition for selecting and spotlighting your work, because I was so glad that you were able to participate in the program. It just completed its 4th cycle, and so stay tuned. Hopefully for 2024 you can all visit cycle 5. We have some great alums from the program in the audience, so it's very nice to see faces from the Artists on Site initiative. So now that we're sort of transitioned into this space, can you talk a little bit about how you selected the title, how you worked with the Anya Tish team? Because I think most people looking at your work connect with the idea of pattern in your work. Can you unpack a little bit for the audience the idea of power?
Yes, definitely. So for me personally, I've often seen art in the contemporary space that uses a lot of pattern. But oftentimes that pattern is utilized as just decorative. And I have for a long time thought about pattern as an active participant in the storytelling process. So it's this idea that pattern comes from somewhere, it has its historical roots, it travels from different parts of the world into different spaces. So I really consider, where does a pattern come from? How have philosophers written about particular aesthetics? How have writers thought about particular shapes and forms? And how those shapes and forms enter into the contemporary space, enter into different societies and cultures. And so for me personally, I feel like patterns have a lot of power embedded into them. This idea that it can translate certain ideas without having to necessarily vocalize them in a literal sense.
Yeah, I think the pattern's power also is pattern as messenger, like what you're talking about. And I think the work that embodies that best in this exhibition is the sunrise painting. Can you talk a little bit about your approach to that work and help visitors connect with it?
Yeah, so in many ways, the sunrise painting also comes out of my time at Asia Society as an artist on site. When I was there, we had a lot of people come and visit the gallery, and they would be wearing different patterned clothing. And I became very interested in how the things that people wear can be not only a reflection of the individual, but also a reflection of how they see themselves, how they might associate themselves with a particular culture and place, and how those patterns can come together to form a landscape. And so I used patterns from textile traditions and painted that into two major paintings. One was called Terrain, which was showcased at Asia Society, and the one here is called Sunrise. This idea that certain patterns that come from East Asia could be utilized to consider the sky. Certain patterns that come from Central Asia could be considered an element of water. And these traditions are coming through into the landscape to create a new form, a new shape and place. Yeah.
Yeah. The other reason that I love this painting is the idea of different times being collapsed into one plane.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the passage of time in terms of sunrise, deep night, that kind of thing related to this painting?
Oh, definitely. So the painting that's showcased here is called Sunrise, and it's part of one of 4 other paintings. So essentially there's sunrise, sunset, daylight, and deep night. This idea that the patterns themselves are coming across from many different centuries and time periods, from the contemporary time, modern times, historical eras. So like I'm pulling patterns from 16th century and deriving my own imagery out of it. I'm pulling patterns from the 10th century and I'm looking at imagery from a historical perspective, but also what does that imagery look like in the present day, in the present moment. And it's almost like as the sun is rising, setting, as the moon comes out, these imagery and patterns are kind of transcending their spaces of origin, places of origin to, basically coexist throughout time.
Right, because I think a tendency to think about time as a linear projection, a starting point, a middle, and a terminus at some point, either now or in the future. And I think that your work does a beautiful job of reminding us that time is actually cyclical. Yeah. So this idea that you're dipping into the past and pulling threads forward to see how they apply in the contemporary space, what we can still learn from things from the past, how they can be reinterpreted. So I think that's a beautiful segue if we can talk about the works that are based in sort of contemporary retellings of fables. This is the hard part of the talk for me because it's really tough to pick a favorite. I really love this series that you're working on, and I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how it first came to you. Like, this would be a really rich vein to mine for a new series of paintings.
Oh, definitely. So I became interested in fable mostly when I started thinking about my childhood. So I grew up in a home where, in a very traditional South Asian styled home in the US. So it's like I lived with my grandparents, my parents, my siblings. We were all in one home. And it looks like we might have like a power outage. Growing up in a, there's a term for it.
Intergenerational.
Intergenerational home. My grandmother would often tell me different stories. And these were stories that she grew up learning about and hearing about in India. So in many ways, those stories traveled into the United States as well. And those are the stories and fables I grew up learning about. And it wasn't until I was much older in college that I realized that those bedtime stories actually come from very rich literature. And those fables have been translated into English. So that's where I learned, like in a deeper way, about the case of the animals versus man, which is one of the paintings that's featured here. And that was a story I remember hearing about in the 4th grade. And it wasn't until I got to undergrad and grad school that I actually read it and reread it. And I realized that, this is a way to talk about.
as somebody who drove north on 59, I can tell you that there's like the mother of all thunderstorms coming up the freeway. So if we do have a power disruption, don't panic. We'll use our big voices so you can hear us. And we'll just sort of sit in the dark together until the power comes back on, unless, Dawn, you have other ideas about that. But that'll be our operating premise. You can hear it. It was following me, and I apologize in advance.
Yeah, I was like, okay, do I just keep talking?
Just keep going. Okay, so fourth grade, hearing the stories and finally having a chance to read them in translation.
Exactly. And so like I realized that these fables had a lot to teach me. This idea, for example, in the 10th century, there was this group called the Ikhwan al-Safa who wrote The Case of the Animals versus Man before the King of the Jinn, in which animals, they sue mankind for their ill treatment of nature. And I was very much interested in that idea that, wow, even in the 10th century, there was this question and concern for animal rights and this question and concern of humans affecting nature. And that's something that we can all relate to in the present time as well. This time period where we have a lot of storms coming through, power surges, winters are extra cold and summers are extra hot. We all feel it. We're all kind of affected by that. And so it was almost like, there was a lot of lessons that were embedded in these fables and stories that are still being taught today. And then even with each of these kind of paintings behind me, for example, the painting of the elephant. So this is a painting titled Creature in the Dark. And it's based off of Jalaluddin Rumi's Masnavi, which is a poetry that was written by Jalaluddin Rumi, in which there's a smaller sub-story called Creature in the Dark, where these group of Hindus come in, they bring an elephant into a dark tent, and then they bring in people who have never seen an elephant before, and they tell them, okay, what is this creature? And they're not able to see the creature, so one person's holding the elephant's leg, and they say, oh, it's like a tree trunk. One person holds the tail and says this creature is like a serpent. And every individual that's touching different parts of the animal is concerned, and they're thinking about, oh, like, this is what the animal must be, and they start arguing with each other. And I felt like even that fable has something very important to teach, which is that in a world where we have phones, where we have our own micro bubbles that we live in, we can very quickly have this world view of this is what the world is like, and everyone has their own perception of how they are experiencing life. And so I felt like even in this poetry, this epic poetry, there was this deep lesson that still connects with the contemporary space.
Yeah, I think that just so for reference, the painting that we talked about first is there on the short wall. I think there's a kind of hubris, or I don't know, a conceit of being 21st century people that, 10 centuries back, people weren't concerned about the environment. They were living in some sort of idyllic setting where that wasn't a concern. And what I think is so fascinating about the story is, the animals make their case for why they shouldn't be subjugated, why they shouldn't be under the dominion of human beings. Yeah. But at the end of the day, the story ends with the animals being told, like, tough, this is the way it's going to be, right? So I think it's a very much a cautionary tale that we do carry forward, and we can learn a lot from now in this sort of moment of environment where we find ourselves.
Definitely. Yeah. And I definitely agree, because, in the first kind of painting that I talked about where animals sue mankind, in the end, the judge in that court case was a genie. And the genie essentially said, okay, well, animals, too bad. The humans are superior to you. There's nothing that you can do about it. But the genie had also kind of said this cautionary tale of, at the end of the day, the humans will have to reap their consequences. So it's like, even though the animals can't do anything about it, it's the humans that will have to face the consequences of their choices. And so that really kind of stuck with me, this idea that, when we're part of that animal kingdom. Even though there is this level of erasure from it, we're still part of it.
Yeah. And then because it's behind you, I don't know if you can turn and talk a little bit about this one.
Definitely. So this one is called Kalila and Dimna, and it's based off of a 6th century fable that comes from the Indian subcontinent. And it was originally written in Sanskrit, and eventually it was translated into Old Persian and Arabic. I'm going to try and speak a bit louder over the thunderstorm.
Yeah, and if you can't hear us, Prince, give me the high sign and we'll boost it up.
Definitely. So this is a fable in which there are 2 jackals that essentially retell stories, and it's a story of 15 chapters. So they're telling 15 different fables within this story. And the jackals, they basically insert themselves into every story. And in every story, they're causing mischief. So they're kind of the ones involved in the gossiping and the disruption of friendships. And one of the more famous fables out of this story is where the 2 jackals, they're working under the kingdom of the lion. So the lion is the king of the animal kingdom, and he's friends with this ox. And the lion and the ox are best friends. The lion trusts the ox in basically all of his troubles, and he'll trust the ox with advice. He'll ask the ox, like, what would you advise me on with this problem? So they were best friends, and the 2 jackals, one of them was very jealous of this. So he starts a rumor that the ox hates the lion, and the ox is conspiring to kill the lion. And so the lion becomes very distressed by this, that his most trusted friend is out to get him, essentially. And eventually what ends up happening is that the lion and the ox end up in a fight, and the ox passes away as a result of the gossip, the rumors that were spreading, all because of these 2 jackals. And so I started to think about the contemporary space of how information travels faster than airplanes, faster than cars, and what would these 2 jackals be interfering in a contemporary world where we have planes and astronauts and, a world where cowboy boots exist in the same world as a NASA astronaut. So that was really the play of this particular painting.
I think Erica has a question.
I have a question about retelling and its connection to your process, particularly when it comes to patterns and pattern making. Because I think the first thing that comes to my mind is, of course, textile and fiber art. And so, kind of, how does that inform your approach to making painting and kind of retelling these patterns?
Oh, that's actually a really good question. So over the years, I've basically created my own lexicon of these patterns. So for example, and I can even show you, I might have to point it out on this painting, because for example, this particular pattern in my work, I've connected it with the pattern of the arabesque that comes from Central Asia. And it's become a pattern that I utilize often for water. And the reason for that is because it is a pattern that has no beginning and no end. It's very hard to tell where the artist started the pattern and where it would end. So it connects with this idea of infinite or infinity. And then I've always connected water in a very similar way, where we try to hold it in our hand, but we can never really understand where that object begins or ends. And so each of these patterns I've studied about how they've existed in textiles, how they've traveled, and then how I can derive that language into the painting itself. So this particular grass is always utilized as land or fertile land. The zebra print is often connected with that primordial nature of why humans ever started wearing clothing, with this idea of animal skin being a form of protection and shelter. So even within this, that textile quality, it's inspired out of textile, but then there's this added layer of, rather than it just functioning like the decorative It's functioning to create the landscape. It's functioning to create the narrative on which these stories can unfold.
And I think that question gives us a great opportunity for you to also talk about the paisley.
Yes.
Because I think one of the things about the fable as source is your wonderful emphasis about the way knowledge and meaning can exist outside of any culture. It gets transferred between cultures. The best ideas seem to persist. So whether something, originated in India and then was transmitted to Persia and then, was translated into Arabic or European languages from there, we have a through line. And I think the paisley, to Erica's question, is this idea of a through line via textile. So can you talk a little bit about how you work the paisley into your paintings and what it means to you practice?
So the paisley is probably the pattern that I have loved for a very long time. Like, it's really where my painting has started from. And it's basically this leaf-like pattern. And that leaf-like shape, many scholars believe originated in somewhere in Central and South Asia, but there's no certainty that it was indeed started and created there. But what I like about it is that there is no guarantee of its origins. It's this idea that it somehow always existed in the making process. And many philosophers wrote about this leaf-like pattern being a representation of the garden, or even the embodiment of all of nature. So this idea that when the leaf repeats itself over and over, it's like all of nature repeating itself over and over. And that was like a concept that just, struck me. It really blew my mind, this idea that that infinity, which is boundless and endless, could then be repeated as another boundless, endless entity. And even when I think about it, I'm like, how is that possible? Like, how can that thought process exist with a design? But then what's also special about the paisley is that it has this very rich history of the human storytelling process. So the paisley has been traded through the Silk Road, where it arrived in Western Europe, but it also traveled to Western Europe through colonialism at some point too. The paisley design found itself in East Africa. It's found itself in North Africa. If anyone's familiar with 1960s American hippie trail throughout Asia, that was a very popular design as well. So it's like, it somehow transcended time in the sense that it transcended its origin of time, but then it transcended its origin of place, and it entered into so many different cultures and communities and heritages, which I personally find very special. There's no necessity for people to know its, definition, but there is this idea that its aesthetic has somehow been able to find a place in people's hearts.
Yeah. Question?
You're talking about the paisley as a through line, and that made me think of the actual through line that goes through your work.
Yeah.
It's a really beautiful way to connect all of the stories and how it connects to the creation. I just want to talk a little bit about, is this the first time you've done this through line and how it has utilized throughout the gallery?
Yeah, so I have done kind of this line work in the past. Here it's probably more than what I usually do. Usually the thread that kind of goes through the painting and kind of extends out of the painting is much more contained. But in this particular exhibition, I really kind of pushed the line out further. It's very much this idea that each of these fables and each of these paintings, they're inspired out of different centuries, essentially. These fables were not all written in one century in one place by one writer. They were all written by different writers from different empires and different political landscapes, but they were all inspired by each other. And in many ways, many of these writers were thinking of each other and considering some of these stories. So I was interested in the idea of the thread entering through these works in this very kind of almost lightweight way, as a way to consider that not only are these stories relevant to us today, but that these stories were in communication with each other as well.
And then just because they're tucked in. So after the talk, we invite you to spend time in the gallery really absorbing the works with these fresh ideas. But can you talk a little bit about the smaller set? Because I love the scale of Sunrise, and these are obviously very special to me because of their histories. But can you talk a little bit about the set as well?
Definitely. So it's the smaller paintings, and they're kind of like tucked away in the backside. Those paintings, I feel like, are much more of a direct thread to the contemporary space. So many of the images are based off of pretty much contemporary life. So there's a painting titled Quarantine, but the aesthetic that the characters are wearing is very, South Asian style clothing. But this idea of these characters are connecting to our contemporary world, but also playing with patterns as a way to further that storytelling process.
Yeah, I think that's great encapsulation of that. Something that you were able to experiment with at Asia Society, and I love that you're continuing to work with here, is sort of modifying the space through specific focus of an installation. Can you talk a little bit about how your thinking of that has changed over the last several years?
Oh, definitely. So I first started working with installation in 2019, and I was interested in this idea of manufacturing the garden, and it comes from my love of Mughal gardens. And Mughal gardens are essentially these four-walled intramural spaces where, the interior side of the wall is the manufactured, very beautifully manicured garden, and everything outside of the wall is this idea of chaos and disruption. So it's like perfection on the interior and chaos on the exterior. And that idea of manufacturing and having a hand in how nature can be constructed and creating this connection of paradise on earth is something that I was very much interested in. So the installation functions in many ways like that, this idea of manufacturing paradise within the exhibition, but at the same time, viewers are introduced to the raw material that inspires all of my paintings. So this idea that all of my paintings are inspired from fabric and textile, and then this is the first time where individuals can actually touch the textile. So, yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the animation?
Yes, definitely.
That's coming.
That's like the next thing from the installation.
Before we go to that, I do want to talk a little bit about one aspect. For anybody who's lucky enough to spend time in a garden here in South Asia, in Iran, wherever you are, this idea of esoteric versus exoteric, and the sort of inner knowledge or the sort of initiated knowledge. If you could talk a little bit about how that's part of your practice.
Oh, definitely. So that's like a very big element within my work, that idea of esoteric and exoteric. So this idea of spiritual versus the worldly. And within the work itself, there is that element of, even within the installation, this element of when you're within the interior part of the installation, the sound itself, the echo of the room also reduces. It tries to encourage the viewer to look within themselves as well. But even within the paintings themselves, there is this element of many people who see the work might not know the fable itself, might not know the story, and that's completely okay. And then there's that exterior element of, it's more like, in one direction, someone might just view the aesthetic of it. In another direction, someone who might know the story will be able to enjoy the depth of it. But it's this idea that there's a balance and a play between the two throughout my work.
Yeah. Thank you. So the animation, which people can spend time with here, I'd love for you to unpack a little bit about how you've been thinking about animation over these last several years and what pushing the envelope on this one has allowed you to do with this show.
So I've worked in animation for quite some time, but I think I've never really showcased my animation before, and in many ways it's because I was also nervous about showcasing animation. It's really exciting to finally show it in a public space, but this particular animation is called the Paisley's Odyssey. So it's based off of the Paisley design, and it intertwines the history of the Paisley and how it's traveled through the world, but also the fable and fantasy and myth that's embedded with this design. So this idea that throughout the entire animation, for example, because scholars don't know if it truly originated in Central Asia or South Asia, in the animation itself, the Paisley kind of calls itself that I was never born, I just exist. This idea that the Paisley never was created by anyone, it just existed in a space, and somehow it travels through these different parts of the world due to unforeseen circumstances, due to circumstances that was beyond its control. But because of its richness and all of the wealth it embodied within it, that was one of the reasons that it continued to travel across the world. This idea that everybody wanted a piece of the Paisley.
And if you ever want to cause chaos at a cocktail party with art historians that focus on South Asia, make a claim that you know where the first Paisley was ever developed, because it will result in fighting. It's a very hotly contested issue. But I think in this encapsulation and the fact that we see the recurring motif of space travel, this celebration and focus on migration, the migration of stories, the migration of bodies, the migration of knowledge into different parts of the world, I think that that's something that really makes sense for me for Houston, and I'm so glad that you're here working. So thank you for putting all of this work into this exhibition. We love it. We're so happy to be here with you, and thank you for sharing a little bit about with us today.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And as I mentioned, Ruhee will be here to answer all of your questions, so please linger and enjoy the refreshments that are just tucked back there. Thanks again.
Thank you.